South Korea is a glittering, gleaming country with futuristic-looking cities, companies, and culture. But not many people alive today remember that until just recently, South Korea used to be a country in abject poverty. In the 1960s, South Korea was poorer than most African countries, Yemen, and even Haiti. They lacked almost everything a rich country needs. They had no natural resources. They were isolated and far from most other developed countries. And all of their infrastructure was completely destroyed by the Korean War. Despite this, from 1960 until the turn of the millennia, South Korea grew its economy tenfold. That's the third fastest in the entire world during this period. And in less than one lifetime, they moved from complete poverty to achieving one of the highest levels of prosperity possible. How is it that a country with so few advantages could overcome the odds and achieve this? Well, some of the techniques they used were unique and really surprised me. But I think it's an important case study because the Korean experience holds out hope for other developing countries that economic development, once touched off, could be a quick process requiring no more than a couple of decades. From 1950 to 1953, communism and capitalism battled it out on the Korean peninsula. When the Korean War ended, the country was split into North and South. South Korea was left in ruins, and its economy was based on subsistence agriculture. I remember what it was like growing up in Korea in the 1950s and 60s. Food was sometimes scarce. In the springtime, after the autumn harvest had been eaten and before new crops could be gathered, poor people would scour the hills for edible herbs and plants, just as they do in North Korea today. The government tried to promote import substitution. That is, focusing on replacing the stuff that Korea imported with stuff that they made themselves. Growth from this was pretty weak, and things didn't improve very quickly. That is until May 1961, when the military, led by the controversial General Park Chung-hee, carried out a coup and overthrew the government. Korea's fortunes were about to turn around after this decade of weak growth. The new government aggressively drafted 5-year plans, not unlike many communist states, especially those of their northern neighbor. These 5-year plans focused specifically on one major thing: export. Korea had one advantage: a large and concentrated labor force. How could Korea find an effective way to import materials, use their cheap labor to manufacture goods, and then sell them to the outside world? Looking over at their very successful neighbor Japan, Korea got inspired, as they could use it as a kind of blueprint, and the government saw an opportunity to rapidly industrialize in the exact same way, just a few years behind. They started with the easy stuff. Goods that didn't require massive investments of capital, huge amounts of skills or knowledge to produce. Stuff like making textiles and plywood. Things where individual entrepreneurs could set up businesses and start getting people to work. South Korea's cheap labor gave it a comparative advantage. It could import capital-intensive goods and then export labor-intensive goods. The sudden availability of better-paid jobs in the cities kickstarted the mass migration of people from the countryside to Seoul, Busan, and Daegu. They left behind their agricultural tools and informal businesses to work in the burgeoning manufacturing sector. The nation combined these policies with tariffs on virtually every item except for raw input materials, like wood and cotton. Most imported goods would remain expensive, but the actual building blocks for a long-term sustainable economy were allowed to freely flow. So this was a great success. The economy began industrializing with cheap labor and materials driving demand for Korean products in places as far as the United States, and people's lives began to improve. But as things got better through the 60s and light industries popped up all over the place, they began to reach their maximum capacities. The government also recognized this. So during this time, they invested in infrastructure to reduce production costs. Roads, bridges, ports, power plants. Stuff that was meant to allow businesses to flourish and reduce input costs. Put it this way, it's a lot easier to do business if you have easy access to electricity for your machines and like roads to transport materials, ports to send them to the outside world, etc. With better infrastructure and increasingly urbanized people, the government could then more easily invest in education, especially primary education, to create a more skilled workforce. And they could also now lever up into heavy industry, steel, petrochemicals, oil refineries. They knew that individual entrepreneurs would never take the risk of trying to start and fund these heavy industries. A $2 million textile warehouse is a different proposition from a $2 billion steel mill. So instead, the government themselves took on the risk of financing it. From 1962 until 1979, GNP rose at an average annual rate of over 9%, and exports grew more than 33% every year. I mean, imagine that. That's like when a country with oil reserves turns on the taps for the first time and starts pumping oil. Except in Korea's case, it was all humans turning raw material into finished goods and selling it abroad. The government did everything in its power to ensure that exports remained competitive worldwide. If Korean products were too expensive in other countries, they would devalue their currency and make them cheaper. If people tried to import products into Korea that directly competed with the ones Korea made, the government would restrict it. If export businesses were unprofitable, but could be profitable if they were a bit bigger and captured a larger share of the world market, then the government would subsidize them. The defining feature of this new economic model became the chaebol. The word chaebols literally means rich family in Korean, and they're like corporations on steroids. These days, they're household names across the world: Samsung, LG, Hyundai, Daewoo. Government policy was to actively discriminate against smaller firms in favor of the increasingly massive chaebol conglomerates, as it was much easier to centrally support a small handful of competing firms than it was hundreds or thousands. This wasn't exactly free trade as we know it in the West, but it was certainly effective. They created a kind of mutually beneficial feedback loop between the two. If the chaebols encountered problems, then the government would step in and solve them, but only if it meant boosting exports and competitiveness. Once the government decided to invest in an industry, it was all guns a-blazing. The list was endless on the amount of stuff that they would do to support it, but they were always full on. One of Korea's most impressive achievements was how they managed to fund everything with limited capital. The government made sure to feed the chaebols a healthy diet of cheap, low-interest loans. Interest rates in Korea were raised really high to encourage average Korean people to save their money in the bank, to which the government would turn around and use that cheap capital to make sure that the chaebols had everything they needed to become some of the world's most powerful and competitive firms. Korea exported $55 million of goods in 1962. By 1982, it had grown to $27 billion. Despite all of this impressive progress, by 1980, South Korea still only had the 65th highest GDP per capita in the world, and was still behind countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Ecuador, and Jordan. How did they continue the growth and the good times? Ah yes, exactly that. That is an important term, vertical integration. This was about to become the name of the game for Korean chaebol conglomerates. Vertical integration is when a company directly controls multiple steps in its production and distribution process, instead of relying on other businesses for supplies and manufacturing and selling. For example, LG made consumer electronics in the 60s. Then in the 70s, they became a petrochemical company too, which meant that they could make their own plastic for their own electronics. Then in the 80s, they began making semiconductors to put in their electronics. And then in the 90s, they started doing mobile phones. This means that LG is making profit and cutting costs at every stage of the production chain, cutting out all of the middlemen. Korea was becoming wealthy in less than a generation, and the economy was getting way too complex for the government to manage so centrally with 5-year plans. They increasingly decided to take more of a backseat role during the 80s, easing restrictions on imports and foreign investment to encourage competition, and to let the chaebols more or less do their own thing. Success from Korea's growing exports stimulated domestic innovation. Young Koreans were hungry and willing to learn whatever they could to rise through the ranks and break into the rapidly growing industries. The best way to do that is to have a strong understanding of technology, engineering, electronics, etc. And education was heavily emphasized. Talented Korean students would head all over the world to the world's best universities to learn the skills they needed to take back to Korea and succeed. The share of employees with a high school education or beyond in the machinery sector rose from 17% in 1967 to almost 60% in 1984. There was nothing particularly educated about Korean people in the 50s. In fact, if you look up on Quora why South Korea got rich, some people try to claim things like a strong national work ethic or Koreans' enthusiasm for education are the reasons for Korean success. But according to UNESCO data at the time, Korean literacy was only slightly better than India, and way worse than all countries in South America and Central America. Korea needed to have an economy to be able to afford education. Coincidentally, as I'm finishing this video today, on October 14th, 2024, the Nobel Prize in Economics was just awarded to these three guys for their research into why some countries are rich and some are poor. And long story short, their research points back to one major causal factor: the quality of economic and political institutions. Like a strong government, courts to settle disputes, and later, in Korea's case, chaebols. If you want to see a video breaking down the 2024 Nobel Prize research concisely, let us know in the comments. Remember how Korea looked to Japan earlier for inspiration on manufacturing and heavy industries? Well, Japan was also starting to begin its space age arc in the 1980s, and Korea would also soon follow suit. South Korea became a world leader in automobile manufacturing, consumer electronics, shipbuilding, and advanced petrochemicals. It became very common to have large panels of government officials mixed with academics and business leaders who would hold meetings about the planning of the Korean economy. What industries were good to develop? Bioengineering, robotics, fine chemicals, aerospace, defense. When the chaebols became massive global industrial giants, they began to innovate and produce advanced technology. Management of the economy then got a lot less existential and a lot more focused on sustainable growth and internal reform. For example, solving corruption problems and making sure chaebols weren't over-leveraged or over-indebted. Daewoo actually went bankrupt in the 90s because of this, and Korea struggled a bit during the Asian financial crisis. But ultimately, they figured out how to come out and continue strong growth based on technology in the 2000s. It was also helped on by an emergent and growing China, who is now by far South Korea's largest trading partner. Korea is now at the top of the food chain. It exports hundreds of billions of dollars of goods every year. It spends almost 5% of its GDP on R&D to maintain this, and it's achieved tremendous prosperity. I hope if you enjoyed the video, you could like or comment or subscribe or what have you. It would be great for helping us with the algorithm, and maybe check out our other videos on Russia or Vietnam if you want similar insights.